We are now going to learn how to fix the housing crisis. I'm pleased to introduce our next panel, Michael Weinstein from the AIDS Healthcare and Healthy Housing Foundations, Alex Lee, a California Assemblyman, and our own Michael Monte from Champlain Housing Trust, who's Michael is also a college buddy of mine, so we stay in touch. But this is quite an interesting panel. Alex and Michael came all the way from California. We began the housing discussion out there, and it was incredible, and we felt that they needed to talk here as well. And everybody knows the incredible job that Michael is doing at Champlain Housing Trust. So please welcome our panel.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. One of these mics is going to work. Thank you, Jane, so much for setting a stage for us. Today, I'm just going to briefly set the stage for this conversation we're having. I know this is only one of two housing conversations that are focused here at this gathering, but last time when the gathering happened in Los Angeles, which I was very fortunate to be part of, the whole thing was about housing, and I really do think that housing is becoming a great national crisis, not just in California. I've heard from Vermonters here that single bedrooms can cost $1,500 a month here, and I'm like, that's almost California prices now. So whenever I go to somewhere and I see California prices, you definitely are catching up to us in the crisis. For a long time, we have thought for California as the epicenter of the housing crisis, but the same issues are now playing out across the nation. And I believe that there's a lot of solutions in California that we can also learn from, but also learn from other places in the country into how to fix the housing crisis. So today we're going to have a panel to discussion. We're going to be pretty succinct in our remarks because we do want to have some discussion with the rest of the group and talk about housing policy, and we can be as nuanced or high level as possible. But I'll just quickly say and introduce myself as that my name is Alex Lee. I'm the California State Assembly member for the 24th Assembly District, which is in the Bay Area. I'm the chair of the Legislative Progressive Caucus and also chair of Human Services Committee, but also chair of the Select Committee on Social Housing, which is what the big presentation I did last time, which is about getting the public sector to develop affordable housing ourselves and not rely on the private sector. And I'll get out of the way is that my district that I represent is 500,000 people in my area, and that's 5 cities, 2 counties, and I understand that's a bit of a scale difference in Vermont, but it is still the same principles at play here. Not to say that, in California, we also have our own California bubble of California exceptionalism, and we love it to hear when we have shout outs about what we're doing great and all that stuff, but also we sometimes have our blind spots. We don't often see, like how I've also remarked and seen is that under Mayor Bernie's time, you passed a lot of policies 40 years ago that we're still struggling with our own governor to pass right now, especially when it comes to renters. So I really am pleased today to be joining you all today about what models, what discussions we can have, and we can learn about how to solve the housing crisis. And now I'll ask Michael Weinstein to introduce yourself and talk about some of the important work you're doing, and then Michael Monte as well after that.
Hello, I'm Michael Weinstein, the president of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and also the Housing as a Human Right. And we started as the AIDS Hospice Foundation, so we were providing not just healthcare, but housing at that time. And we've gotten back into housing because I'm motivated by the same outrage that I felt of people dying in the hallways of the county hospital in the 80s that I feel now about in the 5th largest economy in the world and one of the richest cities in creation, that we are the homeless capital, not just of the United States, but of the world, because I travel extensively in the developing world. Just came back about 10 days ago from South Africa and Zambia. A month before that, I was in Brazil and Sao Paulo. And nowhere I've been, anywhere in the world, have I seen as many people laying on the sidewalk, calling the sidewalk their home. Just very briefly, well, first of all, the whole issue of housing starts with the rent is too damn high.
That's right.
Okay. That's the root of the problem. Okay. And we can't let that go by. So there's an initiative on the ballot that we've qualified for November called Justice for Renters. You've seen it on the step and repeat. And that's to repeal a statewide ban on local rent control that the real estate industry imposed in the 80s and 90s not just in California, but in 34 states across the union. So that's something we need to wipe out everywhere that it exists. In addition to that, we have bought and rehabbed hotel properties across the majority of them are in Los Angeles, but now across the country. And we are heavily promoting the idea of adaptive reuse. Building new buildings is necessary. Production is necessary. And I'll come back to that later. But the easiest and best way to get people housed as quickly as possible is to take existing buildings and rehab them to make them into homes. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Michael.
Well,
Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you. So this is a difficult crowd to be with because most of them know too much about me or about Champlain Housing Trust. But all those who are CHT members, raise your hand. There are a few of them there. Great. So we are a membership-based, for those of you who are not, we are a membership-based organization established in the 1980s, in 1984, the result of a merger of two organizations, which basically promoted by then Mayor Sanders. The idea was permanent affordability, was shared equity home ownership, and was a way of fighting displacement and gentrification in Burlington's old North End. That key component of permanent affordability is the most important piece of everything we've done since the 1980s. The notion of creating housing and making sure that it always remained affordable to everyone forever has enabled Burlington to have a stock of affordable housing, and this region to have a stock of affordable housing, which simply does not disappear and is always there. I sent you a link to the Lincoln Institute, which is there's a great little clip, 20-minute clip. Bernie's in it. I think I'm in it. Brenda's in it. And in it, it talks about It's Still the One, which is the old North End. It's a very cool video. And it tells a story. It tells a story of the history of the importance of what we tried to do. There are people, so many people here who were a part of this. So my apologies to Brenda and Gary and Peter Clavell and everyone else who was here to do this. But the three things we talked about is preservation, production, and protection. Those three Ps, critical, right? Preservation of existing affordable housing, things like Northgate, saving Northgate, making sure that the existing housing that was there was always going to be there for people, protecting tenants on a range of levels. And we did everything, we tried everything, and some things were successful, but everything from rent control to just cause eviction to condo replacement ordinances, housing replacement, a whole range of things, ordinances that are now in our books in Vermont, in Burlington, and have gone up to the state of Vermont at times as well. And again, producing affordable housing, because the important thing is the rent is too damn high. You need more affordable housing stock. And that's what CHT does. So we have promoted on shared equity home ownership. Can I go on? But as we focus on shared equity home ownership as the key component of what we've done, we have transformed ourselves into looking at housing as a continuum, looking at everything from homelessness to home ownership and everything in between. So we now have 500 people who are formerly homeless living in our housing. We run 2 shelters, a motel and a pod community. We actually have 3 or 4 other buildings which we have built and developed on behalf of other folks who are providing homeless services. We have taken 11 motels and hotels and converted them over the last 12 years, starting with the small ones to now some larger ones over time, as an efficient and quick way of getting people housed. But we still do affordable rental. We still do home ownership. We still do counseling and education. And we have morphed into 5 different loan programs. And I want to go back to farm worker housing is one. Mobile home lending is another. A third is assistance to people of color as down payment assistance for a shared equity program. And the other thing we have done also is we have merged and done community facilities. So even as we do housing, we feel like it's important to make sure that the community has the community facilities it needs in order to grow and prosper. So I won't start doing more than that, but right now Champlain Housing Trust works both on a regional level. We do some programs statewide. We do a lot of conversations on a national level. I'm going to Seattle next week and then Denver after that to talk with other nationalist groups who are promoting and pushing for affordable housing solutions at a state and national level. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. So I particularly find that very illuminating because you share the stage with two other Californians who don't know very much about it. In fact, when I got here, I was like, why is it called Champlain Lake Housing Authority? I was like, wait, it's like, the town's not called Champlain. Champlain. So that's how much little we don't know in our California bubble. But just
as an explorer back in the
exactly, yeah. So, but going back to Michael Weinstein, you know, so you've done a lot of work, obviously, for justice for renters, and many a time, although it's very difficult in California, to fight for basic tenant protections that Burlington actually achieved, like I said, 40, 50 years ago. And in California, just to set the stage, there nearly half the population, if not more, are renters. And yet, in our state legislature, there are only 5 out of 120 of us who are renters. I'm one of them. So less than 5% of us are renters. In fact, there are
25% are landlords.
Yes, exactly. 25% of legislators are landlords. So while we own 0 homes, most of them own multiple homes. In fact, in my own district, which I still think is the epicenter of the housing crisis, my own zip code, and I got a special prize because I said it to the Association of Realtors conference, I got the exact number right, is that the average home price for a single family home right now sells for $1.6333 million right now. And I got it right on the money. And they're like, how'd you know? It's because I stalk Zillow every month to look for a house maybe. But it's impossible, right? So I just wanted to ask you, Michael, why is it so important that we continue our fight for renters in the state politics in California, and if not nationally as well, even though there's so many odds against us constantly?
I'm going to, say at the risk of being challenged, it is the #1 bread and butter issue in this country right now. Okay, and we're talking about a national election and motivating young people. Okay, young people very typically are paying 50% or more of their income. Right, a young person is not thinking about getting sick. They're invincible. Right, they're thinking about every single month that day comes up where they have to write that check for the rent. I mean, in Los Angeles, if you are at a minimum wage job, right, it will cost you 100% of your wage for the average apartment. Okay, and also I'll just say this very frankly, because 5 years ago when I spoke here, I said that housing is not high enough on the progressive agenda. Okay, and it still isn't. It's come up a little, but not nearly enough. And I think that, as has been talked about last night, is our job as progressives is to do everything we can every day to make people's lives materially better. Right? And this is an area that we have to focus on. Also, we talk about big oil, we talk about big healthcare. Okay? Real estate is the largest industry in the world. Okay? And what's happened in particular in this country is that there's been an invasion of corporate real estate, buying up multifamily houses. I mean, it was so sickening, like in California, after the financial crisis, particularly in areas like Central Valley and other places. So people were foreclosed on who've been given these bad loans, right? Then companies like Blackstone came in, bought the house, and rented it back to the person who'd been foreclosed upon, right?
At a higher rate, too.
Yeah, well, at an exorbitant rent.
Yes.
So I don't think you can really exaggerate, the magnitude of the problem. And, what is the essence of why? The essence of the reason is because we're treating housing as a commodity. We're not treating it as a necessity. We're not treating it as a right. Basically, it's whatever the market will bear. And, I want to address what you said, which is really, really important, which is I understand, and everyone who's involved in housing justice understands that rent control is not the answer or the only answer, right? It stems the bleeding. The purpose of rent control is to keep people in their homes, number one. But number two is to sustain the supply of affordable housing. Almost everywhere now, even in places that had rent control, fairly strict rent control before, you now have a thing called vacancy decontrol, which means that every time somebody moves out, it goes up to the market rate. Every time that happens, the pool of affordable housing goes down, right? And that's catastrophic. We also have a law in California, which I believe happens in other places as well, where a landlord can take something off the market, turn it into a condo or a hotel, or they say they're going to move in, okay, and that person is out. That's tens of thousands of units. But the other two pieces are the preservation of community. First of all, people don't live, by bread alone. They don't live by just having an apartment. They live by having a community that nurtures them, right? And what's happening in so many cities is that, we had white flight in the 70s. Now people are moving into the city, right, to avoid the commute or for whatever other reasons, right? So what are the areas that are being targeted? The close-in places, primarily people of color and poor communities, because that's where the land is cheaper, right? Okay. What you put on top of that is that, I recognize that it's popular to talk about zoning, right, and the issues with zoning, right? And the legislature, California legislature, is obsessed with it. Just dozens and dozens of bills, okay? But what mainly happens is that almost all the development is luxury. So somebody buys a piece of land that they can put 100 units on, and they get an exemption. Now they can put 300 units on. All of a sudden, that's better than printing money. That land overnight is worth 3 times as much. And virtually none of the communities we live in have what we call inclusionary zoning, meaning that they're required to have a percentage of units that are low income. And even when they have inclusionary zoning, every time you hear affordable housing, hold on to your wallet. Affordable housing goes up to 120 or even 140% of the area median income. I'm not saying you're rolling in dough or you have it great when you're making, in LA that would put you up to $120,000. I'm not saying you're rich making that kind of money, but you don't need the government's help necessarily. You can pay the $2,700, right? When we talk about low-income housing, we need to talk about the person on disability for $1,200 a month that they're getting, right? We need to talk about, the person in the minimum wage job. We need apartments that cost $600, right? Not $1,600. So, the other thing I want to say is, when we're looking at, one of the things that's harming the Democrats is inflation, right? And because people are feeling like they're, getting, less and less for the money they make. And by the way, I have to say that, overall, in many places, the increases in rent are outstripping what's being the wages and even what union wages are increasing by. So it's still a net negative for the majority of working class people who rent. But the so the issue really comes down to the fact that I was going to say about inflation finish that thought was that 60% of the inflation in the last year and a half has been housing, has been shelter. So you cannot have meaningful, long-term reduction in inflation without controlling the cost of housing. So, the politics and the need come together. So I hope, in making this appeal, I hope that, we have the creme de la creme of progressive America here. I hope that you will go back and start thinking about, how you can plug into it. And again, I'm so thrilled and honored that that Bernie has come on board as an endorser of our Justice for Renters. We got the California Democratic Party endorsement, Maxine Waters, Dolores Huerta, a who's who of great people, but they're going to put $100 million against us. And we're ahead in the polls, but that's before the aerial bombardment happens, right? And so, the safe money is, we've put this on the ballot twice before, the safe money is we'll lose. And that's why the only antidote to that is a movement from below. It is a renter's revolution. Nothing short of that is ever. I mean, Sacramento is where renters' rights go to die. Every year, this repeal of this ban is introduced. Okay. For 5 years, it couldn't even get a hearing. A couple of years ago, it got a hearing and died. This year, it got a hearing and was amended to take all the teeth out of it, okay, by the chair of the committee. And then when it went to the floor, that same chair voted against it. That's where we stand.
So sounds very optimistic in California, as you can tell, in our struggles. But the ironic truth of it is that as the housing crisis gets worse, and you have to learn from us because we are like the epicenter and gets worse and worse and worse exponentially every year, is that the truth of the political reality is as the material reality gets worse, that is why the polling is getting better on this. It's just that it's getting so insufferable that people, even if they were skeptical renters in the first place, start turning towards our solutions, which is ironically beneficial to our cause. Michael Monte, I wanted to talk to you about, you've talked about the whole continuum of services and incredible stuff you've been pioneering for quite a while here and that we're trying to learn from. But, obviously we still notice here in Vermont, in Burlington, that, see, I'm so used to saying in California. In Vermont, we still notice there's homelessness, there's still high rents. What do you think is missing out of the equation here? What kind of solutions or policies still need to be enacted here, even though you're so ahead of us in policy? What do you think is missing?
That's a great question. So that's my daily job, is to try to fully understand what to do next on this. The key part of anything around homelessness is to have affordable housing, and you just need more of it, and you need good rents to do that. I would say that our rents start at 60% of median income, and they go lower. So we never have those kinds of things. The policy in Vermont generally around affordable housing is permanent affordability and really meeting the needs of people who are homeless. We just need more resources to build more housing. Mr. Pichek is here. He has put some more money into the creation of more affordable housing. We had a bill in the House last year, and it was $100 million a year, which is significant money, not for you guys from California, but significant money for Vermont, to create affordable housing for the next 10 years, taxing the highest income people, just a couple of percentages, to do that. And we showed if you did that, we were going to be able to build thousands of new units. For us, significant. It did well. It passed the House. It was significant. It was great. It went to the Senate. It got stuck in let's focus on zoning kind of thinking. It died. I think it'll come back. I actually think there is a conversation that could happen in the Senate this year. They looked at it. Some people looked at it afterwards, after it was over, and we say we'll need more money. The key part is money.
Financing.
It's really not more complicated than I wish it could be more complicated than that, but it's not more complicated than that. It's really how do you build more affordable housing? And the way we've done it in the past decade, or especially 5 years, is do it as cheaply as possible. By our cost to build a motel unit is $180,000 as opposed to $600,000. But there's a range of things that we have to do. We have to build more. Interest rates have to go down. Vacancy rate has to go up. The market does have a role, separate from that. But you can't say it's the market. It's really also the need for the creation of more affordable housing units. Vermont's has had an influx. We talked about this at lunch. Has had an influx of people from all over, including homeless folks, but including people with a lot of money buying up housing. Some guy in New York City buying 19 homes in some pastoral setting throughout the state, renting them out as Airbnbs from his place wherever he is in Manhattan. And that kind of stuff has been happening more and more and more, taking stuff off the market. So our home ownership prices are going up. $2,100 for one bedroom. That's the market rent.
That's horrible.
$2,400, $2,500 for a two-bedroom, and that's in the median income. Much of the housing that's being built is $28,000, $3,000, $3,500. So the prices are way out of whack, and the cost of homes to build is $600,000. And that's why that's why we step in and try to create affordable home ownership. Create it more, bring more equity from other sources. Our homes sell for $175,000. And there's a shared equity in the context. People build wealth, the community retains wealth and holds on to the wealth for the next generation. We pay it forward. So we have 678 homes like that. We sold 30 homes last year just on the stock. We have agreements with Habitat. We have agreements with developers to do housing on our behalf. We have inclusionary zoning, and certainly in Burlington. I mean, there are people who have battled for all of these rules, IZ, and all these other rules in this room who sat out at City Council with I think it was Terry Baristas who said, when you did something that's radical in Burlington, you wore a tie and jacket. And if you wanted to do something that was really conservative, you came in with your jeans. That was the best political advice Terry ever gave to passing laws. But I think that has created, I think, a framework that has retained. If you go to the Old North End now, you will see lots of different people. A level of affordability doesn't exist in most communities, and sort of a stabilization of that neighborhood that is different than other places. If you go to the adjoining neighborhood, a city of Winooski, where it's not as strong as it should be, people are being displaced. People are being kicked out. Folks are fleeing the city because they can't afford it. That's something we're beginning to work on right now.
Absolutely, thank you. So, I want to focus on one of the points that you talked about and how simple it may sound, is that a key to a big part of the housing crisis is financing. So a lot of legislatures and even the federal government now is talking about zoning. I think zoning has an important pivotal first step in it, and it's very easy for even bipartisan agreement to get to, because fundamentally it's about what can a private owner do with their property, right? If someone wants to tear down their house, turn it into a fourplex, why not? If someone wants to build an ADU in it, why not, right? Those are the kind of zoning conversations we have. It's just about changing how we use with land and how to be more smart with it. That's a base foundation. The second question that must follow as progressives is, once we have now enabled more land to be allowed for housing and affordable housing, who is the one to deliver on that mission, right? It should be on mission-driven nonprofits. It should be on the state or the government to do so. But increasingly, almost 99.9% of all development is done by the for-profit private sector, right? And so and why I want to go back to financing is important, is as even though the housing crisis is so bad, even though the demand is so high, why is it then supply is so low? Is because two things, right? One, financing is really bad right now. Interest rates, all this stuff. So you are seeing private developers even scaling back their developments because it's much more profitable to sell $1 million condo than to rent out lots of smaller units of apartments, right? Just financial sense. And secondly, is there are a lot of actors out there that profit off of scarcity today. It is within their own business interest to have scarcity, to keep the price high. And that is the kind of greed you see in it, right? Because if market forces work perfectly, we just see a flood of supply, right? Because there's so many people who need a house and so many people who would pay a reasonable price for it, right? But you're not seeing that. And that's why financing is so important. And a financing idea that, if I can pitch to policymakers here, is two things. One is to embrace a revolving loan fund. Montgomery County in Maryland has really been embracing and doing this. Actually, in the video that you sent me, Michael, it describes actually our status quo system, basically our tax credit system of how we do affordable housing. Most of it, unfortunately, is the government throws money at the private sector, and they deliver some housing, and then the private sector pockets it, Wall Street most of the time, big banks. And then the affordable housing, those covenants expire after a certain amount of time, right? And there's lots of loopholes to do that. So they profit 2 times on that. But that is the status quo that we've existed since like the Reagan times, when they really vastly defunded public housing and all our tools do so. What we need to return to, and this is kind of the bridge version of a talk I did in the last session, is that we need to return to having the state be a strong actor in the provision of housing, just like we do with libraries and roads and schools, where no questions asked. You need to go to school, you need to go to work, you can drive on the road, right? And a kind of example about the 3 Ps we were talking about, why we need production, preservation, and protection, is that this system works well in a place that I always like to refer to in Austria and Vienna. For over 100 years, their government has been a vast producer of affordable housing, and that has enabled 60% of their community to live in social housing, 60% of a city of 2 million people, roughly, and it's worked for 100 years. And I want to say, as a political kind of vision and aspiration, is that the Viennese, the Social Democrats, in 1919, figured out to do a 1% income tax, basically, salary tax, to pay for all this stuff that's worked for 100 years. And it was part of their whole abundance as socialists to do a program of abundance and deliver. They delivered on childcare, nutrition, because literally people after World War I didn't even have enough food, and housing, and it was so bad. And I always use that example is because if a country that was just destroyed in World War I, when we defeated them, basically, it was so bad and they could reinvent themselves and provide for housing as a universal human right, then we as the most powerful nation in the human history could do that too. And so that leads me to our last kind of panel question, and then I'm going to open up for a discussion with the group, is that I know tomorrow, Jane is actually going to be on this panel about how can we modernize our housing bureaucracy. So what would the advice you say for our federal partners? What more needs to be done at the federal level or even state level to get more affordable housing delivered for people?
Well, first of all, I want to say that it was great to hear President Biden in the State of the Union address talk about renters and talk about relief for renters. So that was great. I mean, when you think about social policy, it's about aligning incentives. So we wanted to support home ownership, right, in this country. And how do we do that? By giving people a huge tax break, right? And that has shifted the whole landscape so that people could and wanted to buy homes. We have to do a similar thing with the financing of low-income housing, right? Which is, first of all, the amount of federal and state money that goes to pure subsidy has to increase radically. And as part of the Build Back Better, there was a huge amount of money for that, which got lost in the shuffle. We need to treat, we have public utilities commissions in most of the states, right, which regulate utilities. Housing is a utility, as much as, gas or electricity or water, right? And therefore, the amount that rents can be raised, has to be limited and reviewed. One of the things that unfortunately, that some liberal Democrats have embraced is the trickle-down theory. The idea that whatever you build, it'll somehow alleviate the problem. But, it's like, it doesn't matter how many Ferraris you build if all you can afford is a Chevy. And the reality is there's not one housing market, there's multiple housing markets. Because those people who build those speculative buildings, they're not going to lower the rent. They'd rather keep it empty and get a tax deduction than lower the rent. So there ought to be taxes on empty units in those buildings. But any time that an exemption is given that allows you to build bigger, you should either have to include units or pay a hefty rebate to the government agencies so that they can use that money for that purpose. But, you think about what happens. I mean, if we have an earthquake, knock on wood, it doesn't happen. But I mean, or when FEMA goes, we treat it as an emergency. We're not treating the housing crisis right now as if it is an extreme humanitarian crisis. And if we did that, then I think the solutions would follow.
Well, I think Vermont has most of the policy right. And I think nobody gets a tax credit in Vermont, low-income housing tax credit, without the housing being permanently affordable. And without, if we're involved, us owning it outright after 15 years. And so we have a housing stock that is just permanently affordable, that is never going away. And I know there are other communities where it disappears in 15 years and people are profiting. That's crazy. That's a federal law that could change. Very significant, I think. But even adopted on a statewide basis, that could make a difference in lots of communities. I think more stable enabling legislation or even legislation on a local level for inclusionary zoning is critical. That's been valuable in the city of Burlington. I think a whole range of tenant protections need to be discussed again in many of the communities.
National rent control.
Yes, needs to be discussed again in terms of what we need to do to make sure that renters are simply not the vagaries of the market at this point. So you were right on everything. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I know we went over a lot of different terms in the housing world, and not everyone here is housing nerds like us. So I want to open up if there's any questions. I don't know how we should do this, but if there are any questions, please raise your hand over here. And if you could say your name, too.
So I'm Josh Farley. There's all this talk, it came on the paper yesterday, Vermont said that biggest increase.
Oh, 1 second. We're going to do a microphone because I know we're doing the live streaming. Okay. And so I'm tech conscious, so we want to make sure everyone can hear you. There you go.
Yeah. So it came out in the paper, I think, in the past couple of days, that Vermont has had the biggest increase in housing prices in the country. You've been talking a lot about supply. I think the issue is really demand. So what we've seen, I talked to a lot of my students, and half the houses in their town have been purchased by outsiders. We did a study here, over 20% of the houses in Burlington don't have anybody living there, so they're purchased by somebody outside. And so what we see, we have a fixed amount of land, and you have people bidding for these homes who don't even live there, driving up the price. We have the second highest number of second homes and the second highest number of homeless people in the country. And is the problem that we don't have enough houses, or is the problem that we have too many people with enough money that they can buy second homes? And also these people who are now, right now, the average down payment on a house here is 60%, because we have high interest rates, so poor people can't afford it, but the big hedge funds, the people with these huge pools of money can just go in and buy it. So the interest rates actually would drive down prices a little bit, but the only people who can then afford it are those who have the money on hand. So I think the housing problem is overwhelmingly excess demand on the part of the rich. As soon as housing prices start to go up faster than the stock market, then the increased price attracts more demand, which drives up prices higher, setting a positive feedback loop. Homes have doubled in size. We have more housing space than we did 50 years ago and more of a housing crisis. And, so I really think people have to take seriously this idea that it is absolutely excess demand in the hands of the rich.
Can I ask a question? Many cities are forbidding or severely limiting Airbnb. Has that taken place here in Vermont?
I can
Yes.
talk to
Yes. In Burlington, and there are people who really can talk to this. If you wanted to, Brian Pines back there could tell about the law. But yes, you just can't do an Airbnb. You have to be regulated. You have to live there. Secondly, it's being taxed. So our housing trust fund went from a few $100,000 to $1 million a year. That's a pretty significant dollar amount. If you did that in the state of Vermont, then, and I'm not suggesting that you simply let the existing vagaries of the market continue. I'm not suggesting that. But if they are going to be there, tax them, take the money, and build affordable housing. So that's at least a solution in terms of that's happening in Burlington. We're going to be able to build 70 units of housing at Cambrian Rise in a year or so, in part because that money is there.
There are states, though, also are talking about additional taxes on second and third homes.
Yes, yeah. And let me just say, I can't remember which one of you talked about, but this notion of taking the 1 or 2% of the highest income people and taking that money and putting it in affordable housing, as you did in Vienna, that's what it was.
So did in Austria, yeah.
That's what we're talking about now in the legislature. That's what we talked about last year in the House. That's what we really need to get the Senate to pass. I don't know if it's going to get past the governor, but it's important that we try and do that. But that's essentially it. It's to build on what we've done already, because we've done well enough, not good enough still, but we've done well with what we've had, because it's all permanently affordable. We just now to create more of an income stream so that we could all create that social housing network.
One last point. There's more empty housing in California by far than there are people who are homeless.
All the homeless people in San Francisco could move into all of the second homes or an Airbnb.
Not even second home. I'm not even talking about second.
Airbnbs.
I'm talking about empty high-end units. There's more of those than there are homeless people in California.
We have a question in the back there from Emily.
Oh, she's a house member of the House.
Our Vermont State.
That's Vermont State Rep.
Hi, Rep. Emily Krasnow, and I serve on the Committee General on Housing in the Vermont State House. And I'm really glad that you brought up the new statistic that we all saw recently about Vermont does not want to be the #1 in rising costs for real estate. Absolutely. I can say that. So as Michael mentioned, many municipalities are taking it step by step. We do have bills introduced in the last biennium, and we'll have more that are really looking at what's a second home, who's living in them. I introduced a bill this year, which is on the governor's desk, so hoping that goes through, that really tasks the Department of Housing to look at the data so that as policymakers next session, we have the real accurate data of our housing market, where we still have not been able to pass a statewide rental registry. This will show how we're doing in development, what our goals and targets are, if we're meeting them. So I think it'll be really helpful as policymakers that we have the accurate picture of what is going on in our housing market across the state. So I'm hopeful that we will see some progress in the next session and that we will bring back the wonderful bill that we worked so hard on in our committee and got through the House. So progress still to be made, but we did have some real accomplishments this year as well here in Vermont.
Awesome.
There's a hand over there.
There's a hand over there.
Hi, Chris Deacon. I'm curious on your opinions, and this is really for anybody, on the role that healthcare and specifically hospitals and health systems have in the affordable housing crisis. So Kaiser Permanente in California has committed to spending $400 million by 2030 on affordable housing units. Do you feel that this is part of the solution? Is this an efficient part of the solution, that they would, hospitals and health systems that receive a huge tax break are spending this money in that way?
Well, we're in a conundrum right now because cost of a new unit is about $700,000. So the problem is that it wouldn't build that many units. One of the things that has happened in California that's really very progressive is that Medi-Cal will help to pay a person, which is the Medicaid program in California, will help to pay a person's rent. And I think that's really an excellent idea. There's also a program in LA County to supplement people's rent and augment the services for people who are frequent users of the healthcare system.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously need every contributor possible to be funding affordable housing right now. And as Michael said, $400 million sounds like a lot, but in California, it drains up really quickly. But it is part of the corporate PR responsibility campaigns now is more and more of them feel the pressure to, especially in the tech companies, and a lot of those promises don't always come to fruition. But it is needed if they do realize their promise on it.
There was I'm going to say a legitimate moment in history in Burlington 7 or 8 years ago when the fellow who was the chief medical officer also worked in the emergency room and said all these people have no place to live. And he was able to create $6 million for us to build some housing. That was great. I'd rather have healthcare costs be more reasonable, frankly, right? But at the same point, there is a recognition from at least a local hospital, and they actually have contracts with us, put people up who are homeless, who are in the hospital because they have no place to go. They can't release somebody. It's cheaper for them to bring them to one of our places than it is for them to house inside the hospital. So there's definitely a connection. That's something that could be done. The hospital folks who we worked with are great. It's also, they're a $3 billion industry. I mean, here locally, this is a $3 billion company, and they're building their own housing right now for their own workers. That's what they're doing as part of their mission, which is great as well. So I have mixed feelings about it. It's a good thing to do, but.
Any other questions out there from our state treasurer up here?
State treasurer. You.
Well, Dave controls the
wait
mic,
for
I suppose. Dave has the real power.
He's Oprah.
Hi, Mark Hughes, Executive Director of Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, and also with the Vermont Health Equity Advisory Commission, the co-chair. And I was just picking up on something that came from the other side of the room, because this is very much a health equity issue. All social determinants of health are so. I'd love to see our conversations as Prague's, and I just claimed it, yes. I just said, Brian Pine's in the room somewhere, you know what I'm talking about. So there is a need, I think, for us to kind of intersect these conversations, though. We've got to talk about housing in terms of, first of all, more than just a place to live, but, the entire spectrum of maybe even home ownership, land ownership. There's that. But then there's also, and I'm speaking in terms of equity, but then there's also education, employment, health services access, economic development, transportation. All of this stuff is intertwined, so to speak. They all got to be. We got to be. And so I'm just hoping that as we continue to have these conversations, that we get some of these other players at the table to be contributing to these discussions and being a part of these discussions, because incredibly important that we're doing this with a whole of government approach across the state, and that we're focusing on equity across the full spectrum of all social determinants of health, because the outcomes here are, clearly inextricably bound. The other thing, too, is I wanted to just suggest that as our policymakers here in the state are doing this work, when we're affecting change like we did with S100 last session, not this last session, but before Keisha's, when we went towards zoning, and as this session increasingly we're moving closer into Act 250, that we're being very mindful of the harm that the pre-existing policy has historically caused as well. So we can also address the repair at the same time that we're doing this work. Because I think it's painful to see, to watch, and it's also irresponsible to do, is when we know that this policy, these zoning policies, and this Act 250 policy has been exclusionary historically and caused a lot of harm, that we disregard that and solely focus on just only making housing available. Let's, as policymakers, please, and those of us who are looking for a better future for all of us, let's focus on the harm that these policies have caused, and also how we can go about, while we are creating better opportunity for housing for all, to how we simultaneously, because we can do more than one thing at the same time, repair the harm. Thanks.
Thank you. And I believe we have a question from our Vermont State Treasurer up here as well.
Thank you.
To close, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Alex, for the question. I just, Michael mentioned that there are a lot of empty homes throughout the country, and I saw an MIT study that talked about 50 million bedrooms every night that go unused, and the proportion for Vermont would be about 100,000 bedrooms that go unused every night. And you think about the number of people who are homeless, or the number of people who are employers that are seeking jobs that no one can fill because they don't have homes. I mean, that could take care of the problem. And we're one of the second oldest states in the country. So I guess my question is really focused on senior housing. I think there's a lot of seniors in Vermont who are sort of overhoused and they don't have anywhere to go. And strategically over the next decade, I think that's going to have to be a focus of ours. How do we build more housing for that population? I wonder if it's something you're confronting in California, or have any advice for us here in Vermont?
Well, I mean, I think the basic economics of the situation is that the average Social Security check is about $1,200, right? Which can't buy you any housing comparable to what they currently have. I think also that, it can be very disruptive to a person's life to move from a place that they've called home for decades, I think that also right now, because of interest rates, but also because of the set tax base that a person has in a house, right? If the house is paid off, they could be paying a very low amount of tax, and so they can't find anything comparable to that. So there have been, like in California, there was a bill passed to allow the tax base from the house to be transferred to another house if you bought down. I mean, I think all of these ideas are important, but I think that, I grew up in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn. I was right down from the projects. The projects, when I was growing up, was not a dirty word, okay? And the federal government first didn't maintain or keep places secure, and then they were declared a failure, right? I think if we really want to stay focused on the central issue is that in a country with the wealth that we have to guarantee people a place to live and cover that cost, regardless. Yeah.
Anything? I would just say,
I'll talk to him later.
And I apologize, this is going to unfortunately be our last question. I've got the red light, is So I would say some advice about tackling senior housing is really making sure that, of course, we have the finance streams to do that, but also not be prohibitive, right? So a lot of our, at least from the California lens, or maybe do a little differently in Vermont as well, a lot of our affordable senior housing is really tied to area median income or some sort of income base, right? But for older folks, that could be very different, especially if they had different sources of wealth, and the eligibility can really be messed up. So that's some problems we've had in the past where, you know, you get a source of funding that's based on some sort of criteria or calculation, right? But your senior population you're hoping for, they might be middle class or upper middle class, even older folks, you want to get them to move out of the big house, right? And go to somewhere that is more appropriate and downsized and gonna fit their needs. Those eligibility aspects can also be very tricky, right? Because I think you want to serve as broad range of seniors as much as possible, but you don't want to immediately disqualify someone, right? If someone who has pretty good means and they have a house that you'd rather see in a family turnover, they'd say, you know, why go do this and do everything and I'm not even eligible, right? Like a lot of those little friction points that happen in our system, which is why I'm a big advocate for us going to an Asian and European style system where eligibility is just universal basically for everyone for public goods, is one of those really important things. So financing is obviously gonna be one of those tough ones. Michael talked about, of course, the reality of social security checks being so little is that then you have to deliver cost competitive products too. And something in California we would try to do is leverage our state and public lands, not forests or beaches, but like other old offices, warehouses that is owned by your state or jurisdiction already, because that way you can either ground lease that for almost $1 to a friendly nonprofit developer, or the government itself can do it. That way you cut out a bunch of land costs, right, which is a huge equation of it, and it's been very successful for us because in California, most of the land is just very, very expensive.
I just want to add one thing too, which is we can do a lot. We talked in the last session about the cost of administration in healthcare. We could do a lot to make it less bureaucratic. I mean, getting a shovel in the ground in Los Angeles, minimum 5 years, okay?
Yes.
When you have these low-income tax credits, that doubles the cost of building a unit, right? So I think we can attack it from that vantage point and bring those costs down and get stuff done far more quickly.
Yeah, and especially as the state treasurer, you know, a lot of the administrative costs is what I call stupid costs, just inefficiencies, because a nonprofit or any entity, I'm sure you know this too, applying
Yeah,
for
I'm ready
100
to
grants,
jump in on this one.
right? So you have the ability to unify financing and be like one form, one system,
Yeah.
right, Michael?
18 different sources of funding in the next project that we're going to do groundbreaking on.
Right, and that's
18
time
different
and effort,
sources.
right?
But even getting a building permit
Yeah,
is
a lot of
harrowing.
harrowing. All right, well, on that note, any concluding thoughts, quick concluding thoughts to our discussion today? Let's start with Michael.
Well, I think we've done pretty decently well in terms of a basis for policy in Vermont and also in Burlington. I think there's a ton more work to do. We all know that. There's lots of pieces and parts. I really do believe that it needs not one solution, but about 4 or 5 or 10 solutions. All of them are important. All of them have to be balanced. Resources are the critical piece, though. Can't do anything. We had a lot of money in the last few years. We were able to get some things done. We still need that kind of money for the next 5, 10 years in order to make it work. If Build Back Better was here, man, just rocket ships, you know, frankly, to get things done. So.
The housing crisis is solvable, flat out, period, exclamation point, it's solvable.
Exactly. And I would also say homelessness doesn't have to exist. It's a policy choice. It's a policy choice. And we have all the tools in the toolbox to solve it. And my quick plug, because I know we kind of talked about the supply side aspect of it, is that yes, there are people that will, and corporations that are going to profit off of the scarcity right now, and it's that vicious cycle. But if we look to one of my favorite examples, Red Vienna in Austria, is that they embrace all the solutions together. Because the fact of the matter is, you can't prey on scarcity if there's no scarcity. And the reason that they have ranked 2 years in a row the most livable city in the world in Vienna is because they have a robust public sector development sector. So as a consumer, you say, I can go to a publicly developed flat, a flat that I will have unlimited term in, that is very affordable, has all the great amenities, or I go to the private market, which is much shorter contract, much more expensive. And so that actually has kept the price relatively down compared to other European big cities. And the market itself is susceptible to its own forces. If there is competition, even from the public sector, which our European friends know very well, and I'm always thankful Senator Sanders is introducing me to Scandinavian politics and how they do things, is that if you have a government that plays in competition and forces the market to respond to that, they also have to respond, right? Right now what we have is a market that's unchecked. They have no competition, and so they charge the highest rank. So anyways, thank you so much to the Sanders
Thank you.
Institute for having us, and hope you learn more at home.